the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
The Stevens Institute of Technology is proud to present the Hugo New Corporation Sustainability Seminar Series, brought to you by Brown and Codwell, Geocetic Consultants, H2M Architect and Engineers, BEM Systems, and Catalyst Group.
Okay, great. So I'll start with the role of charcoal in the international energy systems. And for a quick outline, I will talk about energy in industrialized and emerging economies. So I will contrast energy in what we know today as industrialized countries and compare that with emerging economies, which are somewhat less developed and really building their energy systems to almost attain what is attained already in industrialized economies. So I will talk about the global energy system. So in a quick snapshot of what the world looks like today in terms of energy. I'll talk about charcoal as an energy resource, including production around the world, rudimentary charcoal production. I will talk about the global charcoal supply chain, including the biggest producers, exporters, importers, and land to forest area ratios around the world. Then we'll talk about global energy systems again, but this time we'll be revisiting the status while including charcoal in it. Then the global energy transition. I think people that are familiar today with the energy industry know that global energy transition, everyone is talking about the transition, but what does it mean when we have accounted for charcoal as an energy resource? And then finally, we'll talk about who needs charcoal and where is it in the world. And we'll go on to talk about the future of charcoal before going on to your questions. So the current status of charcoal is that, so we're going to talk about energy in industrialized economies. So let me move there. So if you look at industrialized economies, so you're looking at most countries in Europe and also North America, there's more investment in renewable energy sources. So the goal is to move away from fossil fuels, and they're pushing for energy efficiency to basically go away from polluting and reduce the need to build newer power stations by basically being efficient with what they have. So overall, they want to attain energy security while preserving the capacity that they have today to provide electricity to perform the same tasks. So by contrast, emerging economies are increasing investment in electrification because most of them, especially in Africa, are relying on biomass, and they want to stop cutting down their trees. They want to protect their environments and really pursue modern energy alternatives, including electricity and LPG. So they're building these from both renewable and some fossil fuels, but overall the goal is to electrify more and increase the capacity to produce and consume electricity. So in a snapshot, what we have here is electricity access as a percentage of the population around the world. So if you look at emerging economies, I'm not sure, can you see my mouse over? So if you look at emerging economies,
You can see it.
right? So if you look at this part of the world, there's less access to electricity, and that is why these countries are pushing for electrification. But part of the goal is to cut down charcoal consumption, cut down the use of biomass, and attain what is here in this part of the world, more electrification. But what happens when we put charcoal in the picture? So charcoal, first of all, is not coal. A lot of people would use the word coal and charcoal interchangeably, but actually coal is a mineral that is obtained from mining, obtained by mining. But charcoal is quite different, and that's what we're going to talk about. How do we get charcoal in, and where do we get it from the world? So it is definitely not coal. This is what we're talking about. So these can be briquettes, and you can buy this at your local grocery store from anywhere in the world. So if you're in the US, that would cost you about $8 to $12 for 3 kilograms of charcoal. And in Europe, that would be about $1.99, which is $2.30. I mean, €1 99 cents, 99 pence, which is $2.34 if you're in the US. That's for the same amount of charcoal. In sub-Saharan Africa, charcoal is not sold by weight. It's usually sold by volume, and it's highly negotiable. So we made an estimate of what of the charcoal market in Uganda, and found that it was 75 cents for about the same amount. So that is me in Uganda during the field work, buying some charcoal, and you see that it was not packaged in a bag. It was not labeled. It was not, there's no sophistication at all in the final market, but it's about the same product for the same purposes here. In sub-Saharan Africa, you're using charcoal almost on a daily basis as a fuel for cooking. And in most parts of the world, including Africa and other emerging economies, charcoal is used for barbecuing, so outdoor activities, and it's also used in restaurants. I think most people would be familiar with the restaurants that are using char pizza, char to make different foods like pizza. So around the world, this is the status of charcoal production. So between 1993 and 2019, we can see that the trend of charcoal production has gone up across the board. So this is around the world, and almost doubled. So in 1993, you had about 30 million tons of charcoal, but today in 2019, it's about 53 million tons. So this is a real market increase from what we had, 20, 25 years ago. So charcoal is mostly produced in a rudimentary way. As I said, it's mostly produced in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is producing about 64% as of last year. In a year, 64% of charcoal. So here you have the process starting with cutting trees. It's a very manual process. People are using hand tools like pangas. There is use of some machinery, although this is outlawed in some parts of the world, to slow down the rate of deforestation. So a charcoal burner cuts a tree and then piles the wood in such a, with such an outlay. This is done in open forest. I think, as you can see all the way in the background, there's no structures to build the charcoal kiln. Here they covered those trees with the earth. So they cut the earth around the trees and cover it onto the pile of wood, and then light it on fire at about 400 to 600 degrees Celsius for the process pyrolysis to occur. And this goes on up to 2 weeks. In the open forest, it's outside. I think you can see the gases that are coming out. And after 2 weeks, the charcoal would be ready for harvest. But in some parts of the world, like in Brazil, there are some stationary kilns that are put directly in the forests to support continued production in the same area. So charcoal burners feed wood into those kilns and then light them on for about the same temperature to basically attain the same result. The difference between the earth mount kiln that you see above that and the one below is that earth mount kilns don't need structures, and they can just the burners can produce trees anywhere near the tree, anywhere near where the tree was before. So charcoal is lightweight, and when it's harvested, this is what it looks like. People package it. It's the process is still manual, just like the cutting trees. So people package it with almost bare hands into those sacks, and because it's so lightweight, they can pack it on trucks. In that figure that you just saw come up, they pack it on trucks, overloaded, and the vehicle would still move. Although there's very little safety measures depending on the market, the vehicle. So it's driven to the markets, and that is really what happens in most of sub-Saharan Africa. So you would see that replicated in so many countries. So that picture was taken in Kampala, but you would literally see the same image in places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania. So and the list goes on. So knowing how it's produced now, and we know that it's producing a lot, how much charcoal was produced in the past 20 years. So if you look at this map, the scale is in million tons. So this is on average every year since 1993. These are the top 10 producers of charcoal around the world. So you have Brazil producing the most in the world, almost 6.5 million tons of charcoal every year on average. And Brazil is producing so much that it is literally so far ahead of even its second runner-up, Nigeria. So Nigeria also produces a lot of charcoal. And Ghana, you see other countries in there like the DRC, Ethiopia, Tanzania, India, China, Thailand. So what we can conclude here is that a lot of charcoal is being produced in the emerging economies, which is driving their ambition for, energy transitions. They're looking for a solution of getting towards electricity to cut down this consumption. At the same time, we're looking at exporters. So it's a commodity. Most people that produce charcoal are actually in the business of it, and they do trade it on the local market to their local populations, but they also export it. And I think you can tell from here that, well, the scale is in kilotons, and it's an annual average from 1993 to 2017. And I think you've already determined that every country that ends up in the top 10 exporters of charcoal around the world is already producing a significant amount because it's feeding its population. It's sharing that amount with its population, but also with an added export. I want you to observe as well here that Brazil is not an exporter of charcoal, even though it was the biggest exporter, biggest producer of charcoal in the world. So how come it's not exporting any of it? We'll get to that in later in the presentation. So here we have the top producers again, but because we said that charcoal comes from trees, let us pay attention here to their forest areas. So the biggest forests I think we can see is Brazil. That is 67% of their land is forests. So it is not surprising that most charcoal would come from there. the Democratic Republic of Congo as well is more than 50% of forests. But what you have to observe here is charcoal is coming from places that are deserts as well. So if you look at Egypt, around that area is the sub-Saharan desert. And if you come a little bit lower south here, you find Nigeria, which is close to the sub-Saharan desert. So Ethiopia, these countries really don't have enough forests as a percentage of their land area, but also they're at a very big disadvantage because they're located in very hot areas. So interestingly, because charcoal is an export, we had to take a look at where it's going. So if charcoal is being exported and imported around the world, who are the biggest importers of charcoal for the past 20 years? The observation here is that, it's places like Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Korea, Japan, China, Germany, Belgium, France, and the United States. So it's a range of from 53 to 153 kilotons of charcoal on an average every year. So it's quite interesting here because previously we thought that these countries have enough electricity. They have more than 80% of their populations actually have access to electricity. So it is surprising now to see that they're still importing charcoal over the past 20 years when every other country, most countries in the emerging markets are actually trying to replace replace charcoal consumption by putting more electricity in their grids. So the question here is, has electricity stopped charcoal consumption and charcoal imports in these countries? So here again, I'm overlaying the amount of electricity as a percentage of the population, and we are looking. This is a graph we saw earlier, and we're taking a second look here at what the players are in the biggest players in the charcoal trade. So we're looking at Brazil here, which is producing most charcoal in the world. Its electricity supplies almost 80% of the population. United States as well, but it's the biggest importer. So the colors here are coded with what their role is. So you'll see that in the chart for imports we used orange. So the United States, France, Belgium, all of these are key importers of charcoal. And you can see that they're painted blue. They have a lot of electricity. Another unique case is Egypt. We found out that we saw that it's in a desert when we looked at how much forest it's got. It's located in a desert, but it's still a big player in the charcoal trade, even though it also has a lot of electricity. Observe also China. China has a lot of electricity as a percentage of its population, but somehow it is a producer. It's an exporter of charcoal. India and also Saudi Arabia. So the question is charcoal going to be replaced by electricity again around the world? So you look at all these countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, Tanzania, their goal is to increase electricity and reduce the charcoal use. But when you look at these other countries up here, they have attained what these countries are trying to attain, but their charcoal consumption is still high, although the local production is low. So they're buying charcoal as an import. So the challenge of reducing charcoal consumption is that electricity has not fully replaced charcoal. And that is true around the world. And even in the countries that are starting to put down electricity grids, it's funny because their capital cities are importing more charcoal than the rest of the countries that have less electricity access. So you saw earlier in the presentation, I was buying charcoal from the capital of Kampala, from the capital of Uganda, which is Kampala. So that capital is actually has considerably more electricity around the compared to the rest of the country. And we've also seen the dominant importers of charcoal already have access to electricity. And that is true for countries that are basically industrialized as well. And there's so much uncertainty around the charcoal supply chain. So, because people don't know yet where the charcoal comes from, and it's coming from desert, some of it is coming from deserts. And because there's a lot of electricity, there's almost a misconception that electricity will replace it. But we have here some data that shows that it hasn't. So the question here is, does regulation help or hurt the charcoal supply chain? So we're going to find out. So to recap, we've looked at emerging economies here that are transitioning from biomass. They're transitioning from the use of firewood and charcoal to replace with modern alternatives like LPG and also more electricity. In industrialized economies, there's increased electrification and the clean energy transition steadily overshadowing biomass in the energy procurement discourse. So the contrast here when we say transition is that some countries are talking about more clean energy, and some other countries are talking about getting away from firewood and charcoal. So the goal is the same, to reduce CO2 emissions. And so the regulations currently that is in place is the carbon tax. So there's a price on carbon. It is levied on carbon content of fuels with the goal of reducing CO2 emissions. So here we have a contrast of different energy sources. So CO2 is coming mostly from fossil fuels. So this was a life cycle analysis of various types of fuels. And you can see that fossil fuels are producing almost 6-8 times than more than all the other sources of energy. And that's not the only source of pollution that's happening, that's coming from energy sources. So there are other pollutants like particulate matter. For instance, fossil fuels are producing more PM, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide. So most of these regulations are targeted towards reducing fossil fuels. And I think you would know that coal is a fossil fuel and not charcoal. So we're talking about charcoal here. So there are some industries that actually rely on coal, like the steel industry currently is relying on coal. And they are trying to find alternatives to coal as a source of energy. So charcoal is becoming a very attractive energy source because it can be used as a reductant and in sintering and in palletizing uh, those palletizing processes within the steel industry. So because the carbon tax is making charcoal production more attractive by putting a price on coal, putting a price on carbon, you see here that if the steel industry used more charcoal than coal, emissions would fall from 5.3 tons to 4.5 CO2 emissions per kilogram of steel. And the carbon tax is pricing that per ton of CO2. So obviously you see here that overall or generally using charcoal would produce less CO2 according to their LCS, according to some LCS. So The steel industry has therefore located very strategically in the Amazon. So for iron ore and the pig iron industry are in the Amazon producing high amounts of charcoal, which is what puts Brazil in the top of the list for charcoal producers. So we saw it as number one and it's not exporting, which means that most of this charcoal is actually going into the steel industry. And in other areas, they're importing from Namibia to South Africa. And so places that have traditionally used coal are starting to consider charcoal as an alternative. It's going to be cheaper overall. I mean, if you look at economics, it would be cheaper to go with charcoal for some processes only because these processes are interested in the carbon content of these two energy sources. So in households, charcoal is ubiquitous still. Most of the emerging economies, charcoal is ubiquitous. It's going from rural areas to cities. That's where it is. And rural areas are not generally using charcoal because they are relying on other forms of biomass, firewood. So the charcoal stove, even though these countries are really ramping up electrification, it's easy to see that the charcoal stove is more accessible because if you look at two price comparisons in the bottom here, you'd see that the traditional charcoal stove that uses this fuel is only $50. So we're looking at consumption infrastructure. But in contrast, the electricity and gas oven is $600. So it means that more people are still affording the charcoal stove and using it instead of using the fuels that would be recommended as better or cleaner. So if you look at the LCAs, I mean, two LCAs were compared for charcoal and also LPG, and charcoal emits 6.7 kilograms of CO2 per grill session. And if you compare that with LPG is producing almost 3 times less, so 2.3 kilograms of CO2 per grill session. So it is acknowledged that charcoal is more polluting. It is not healthy, but because of the affordability of the consumption infrastructure, people are still using charcoal. It is still preferred in some cases because it is preferably linked to the taste of food. So finally, we'll talk about the future of charcoal here. Emerging economies will still be using charcoal because of what we've seen in terms of consumption infrastructure. The charcoal stove is cheaper, it's affordable, charcoal is everywhere, it's ubiquitous, even with the forests disappearing, it is because production, as we saw earlier, is nomadic. Producers can go and produce charcoal right next to where the tree grew, which increases supply automatically in local markets and also makes exports more available. But also charcoal demand may increase, especially in the steel industry. So it could be more than what is already being produced because the carbon tax is affecting coal prices and is going to make emissions per ton of CO2 more expensive in coal. So the steel industry might be transitioning to the use of charcoal where it can attain those emission savings. So there's indiscriminatory cutting, as we saw. All trees can make charcoal. It comes from every type of tree species, although some are preferred to others. So eucalyptus, for instance, is preferred in Brazil and some parts of Somalia. But most trees can make charcoal, and that supports nomadic production. Trees are getting more scarce, and prices will increase for the regular consumers uh, because of because of market practices like hoarding. When there's scarcity in economics and high demand, the prices go up. So there are still public health risks that are unknown to most home users. We saw in Kampala that charcoal is not labeled. We just buy it using plastic bags, no labels. So health risks are not known to consumers. So most people wouldn't know about particulate matter that comes from charcoal, and also other gases that are involved in upstream production. But most importantly, briquettes can be made from waste materials to preserve the tropical ecosystems. But the solution has very little attention and investment so far. So that is the end of the presentation. And I would like to know what your thoughts are if you have any questions. And we have some references down here.